very much aware that only I now stand between you and getting out in that Athenian sunlight. Well, I really felt the injection of energy from the younger people here, Michelle and Eleanor and Larissa, and slightly different age bracket, but still on the younger side of actuarial tables, Andrea and Colombe. It's great to see new ideas, belief that democracy can be revived, reinvigorated, made broader, made more representative, made more participatory, and it really gives me hope, in a difficult time. The idea of repurposing economics toward well-being, empowering through legal knowledge, these all seem to me to be good ideas. And as I was saying in that earlier panel, building the institutions of democracy is not the work of a few years, it's the work of decades and decades, and it needs dedicated people like all of you. And I had one of the great conversations I had here was with Aoi Watanabe from Japan, who I think is over there somewhere, and her friends. And explaining their belief in new ways of looking at things from a whole variety of different angles, learning. And I found it very stimulating, reassuring that, because what is youth? It's questioning. And we need that questioning to build the decent societies of the future. So this 10th edition of the Athens Democracy Forum felt different to me, and here I'm going to be a little more pessimistic than I've just been. There was talk of nuclear war, that was new. Sabotage gas pipelines spoke of violence brewing. Inflation in Germany, the country for which inflation portends disaster, 1930s, shot up over 10%. And I address you now, right here, as Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, illegally annexes 40,000 square miles of eastern and southern Ukraine, making them part of a Russian motherland he says he will defend with all the means at his disposal. We know what that means. Jaroslaw Kuisz, a Polish journalist, spoke here of nations of, quote, nervous sovereignty. Those nations are in Europe, and that nervousness is once again about being erased from the map, a fate Putin still envisages for Ukraine. We do not expect a temporary truce, Kuisz said. How can there be one, really, when what is at stake is democracy and freedom in the face of threatened subjugation? Do not tell a Pole, ladies and gentlemen, that he should trust in the kindness of strangers, nor an Estonian or a Latvian or a Lithuanian. My Jewish family came from Lithuania. I've seen the mass grave in the forest where they would have ended up had they lingered. Do not pretend that this clear blue sky over Athens may not mask a brewing storm. The nervousness among us, it seemed to me, went beyond sovereignty, vulnerable to the imperial delusions of the Ruski Mir, or imagined Russian world. Beware of myths like that, the Ruski Mir. Those myths can kill. As Günter Grass, the great German novelist, once said, an entire gullible nation believed faithfully in Santa Claus, but Santa Claus was the gas man. No, the anxiety in our gatherings was more general. We hurtle forward, bombarded by social media, beset with conspiracy theories, bereft of any shared notion of truth, consumed by often irrational fear, our climate changing beneath an unrelenting sun, our societies polarized into rival tribes, our communities weakened, our job security fragile, our sense of security rattled by a pandemic that began in China, our loneliness accentuated by remote work. These days, you actually have to say, we met in person. We met in person. Congratulations to everyone here. We did achieve that, and it feels pretty good. The thing that doesn't work about a Zoom conference, as you know, is that you don't have the mingling, you don't have the drinks afterward, you don't have the coffee break where some kind of serendipitous contact happens. And that's why we have these conferences. Okay, it's great to gather in the room and talk, but no, it's meeting people, it's exchanging ideas, it's finding new paths. You know, autocracy feeds on fear and lies. So do pandemics. The plague seeped into a post-truth culture, the perfect medium for its propagation. It fed on inequality bred over decades, taking the weakest and the poorest. As H.A. Temelkuran, a Turkish writer, insisted here to all of us, the degree of inequality generated by global capitalism these past decades is ultimately incompatible with the promise of democracy, which must involve a fair shake for all. A question kept turning in my mind as I listened here. Are we the sleepwalkers? Are we the sleepwalkers? I refer to the sleepwalkers of Christopher Clark's book by that name, who, in another world of declining empires and rising powers, of economic transformation and unpredictable forces, ushered the world, despite themselves, toward the unthinkable conflagration of World War I, with its more than 15 million dead. That was more than a century ago, in 1914. The leaders who, over the course of a month, stumbled from the assassination in Sarajevo of the Austrian Crown Prince by a Serb nationalist to world war, surely had little idea of the horror they incubated in each small decision they made. It's of the nature of tragedy, like Hemingway's description of bankruptcy, to come upon us gradually and then suddenly. We've learned a lot since 1914. After World War II, which was in many ways the product of the first, we built a world of interlocking institutions, international law, and groundbreaking treaties, including on human rights and genocide, designed to ensure that this century did not resemble the 20th century. The greatest miracle of the second half of the 20th century was the European Union, the entity, dull word for a thing of beauty, that became the continent's peace magnet. Yet, we sense now that all this may be fragile. Nothing, Victor Hugo wrote, is more imminent than the impossible. Nothing is more imminent than the impossible. As Yasha Monk reminded us, Cassandra was right, which does not mean that we should not struggle with every fiber of our beings to prove Cassandra wrong. The central divide in our discussions, as I perceived them, was between Jeffrey Sachs's moral equivalency and the fierce moral certitude of Alexander Chekmanov, a Ukrainian photographer who told us quite simply that this will end with our victory, which will be the victory of all the civilized world, of light over darkness, of good over evil. The divide was between Sachs's view of the United States as a white-dominated racist society, no better than Putin's Russia with its culture of authority, or Xi's China with its best-informed professionals in the world. The division between that and those who believe still that the democracies of the world, for all their flaws, for all their mistakes, embody values of liberty, openness, the rule of law, freedom of expression, human rights, and human dignity, essential to ensuring the world does not descend once again into horror. That conviction is, in the end, the raison d'etre of the Athens Democracy Forum. We heard a lot from Sachs about Nancy Pelosi's rash visit to Taiwan and the provocations of the West in expanding NATO to protect societies that had fallen under totalitarian rule for decades after 1945. We even heard that if it came to nuclear war, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, would be most to blame for shunning negotiation and pursuing the recapture of the territories that Russia has taken from it. We heard much less about China's appalling treatment of the Uyghurs, about the camps in Xinjiang, about the crushing of Hong Kong's youth with its demand for cherished freedoms, about an unprovoked Russian invasion of its neighbor Ukraine that has already taken many tens of thousands of lives, about the body bags in Bucha beneath the mistletoe, and about the mass slaughter in Mariupol, the new Grozny in the annals of Moscow's conquest through obliteration. I felt Kuish's bewilderment in my bones when, referring to the collapse of the Soviet Empire 30 years ago, he addressed Sachs, who had played a crucial role at that time in reforming and changing drastically those economies, and said, "It is fascinating to me that you promised liberty to these societies, that they would get out of 300 years of subjugation, get out of this horrible sphere of influence, move towards self-determination and respect of human rights. And now, of such moments is this forum made. Civilized disagreement is the sign of any healthy society. The child without 2 legs and 1 hand, about whom Kuish spoke, would have had those limbs still, absent Putin's violent obsession. The desperate mother from Mariupol would have had a son. It is important, sometimes, always I would say, to keep a moral compass in the face of what John le Carré once called, quote, the classic, timeless, all-Russian, barefaced, whopping lie. Ukraine's sin in Putin's eyes was to look west to Poland rather than north to Belarus for its model. For that, it could not be forgiven. Ukraine could not succeed. That might shame Putin's mafia state. If Ukraine did not want to live with the puppet leaders, referendums at gunpoint, political kidnappings, and sham democracy of Putin, it had to be crushed. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how we got here. The war was Putin's decision, nobody else's. If he's not stopped, no European democracy is safe. Donetsk is the new Sudetenland. After Georgia, after Crimea, after Syria, it's time to draw a line. Vera Jourova spoke here of the people she met in Lviv who said, quote, "We're ready to suffer and die for peace and democracy." I believe the West must stand shoulder to shoulder with them or with her, its values trampled, and its amnesia about the cost, the terrible cost, of being a bystander to horror, plain for all to see. Observing the undying appeal of hatred, Wisława Szymborska, the Nobel Prize-winning Polish poet, observed of hatred how it knows to make beauty, the splendid fire glow in midnight skies, magnificent bursting bombs in rosy dawns. Beside it, reason was one. Since when does brotherhood draw crowds, she wrote. Has compassion ever finished first? Yet they must prevail if the earth is to remain a fit place for human habitation. As Ursula von der Leyen said, democracy is promise. We must, as Beckett put it, fail, fail again, fail better, for the sake of the generations to come. Allow me to say a few words about journalism as I see it after more than 4 decades in this line of work. The killing of journalists happening in ever greater numbers and the killing of truth threaten the foundation of democratic society. Fake news, the disorientation before it, the allusions to fact-based journalism, a new expression, fact-based journalism. Is there any other kind of journalism? If there is another kind of journalism, would somebody in this room please explain to me what it is? As Donald Martin pointed out, there are multiple dangers from this disorientation that is upon us, and the loss or erosion, extreme erosion of a press where we can rely upon facts. And I believe we must answer this with new measures, new regulation, new vigilance, new education, new awareness, but also with something constant that hasn't changed since I was feeding a tape into a telex machine in Beirut in 1982 after the Marines got blown up, when I was covering the war in Lebanon 40 years ago today. And that is, bear witness, speak truth to power, go out across this small planet to find the facts and tell the stories that may occasionally make a difference. I'm a writer, James Baldwin wrote. I like doing things alone. To be alone on deadline is the journalist's lot, facing the many-faceted world and seeking the means to render it as closely as possible, knowing that something in the quiver of life is always ineffable and will slip through the cracks. Patience. It takes time to understand, listen, touch, smell, feel. The subject will reveal itself to you if you restrain the impulse to impose it. The story must build from the inside out, like the butterfly from the chrysalis, with a slow unfolding of wings. Writing begins where the anecdotal stops. Writing dies where the preconceived prevails over the telling detail. In his haunting novel, A Sport and a Pastime, James Salter writes, life is composed of certain basic elements. Of course, there are a lot of impurities. That's what's misleading. Today, contagious impurities multiply. Life becomes an exercise in serial distraction, yielding to the influence of the influencer. Every singular place, what journalists call a dateline, becomes fungible everywhere. Cross the world, remain in your comfort zone. If great journalism involves immersion in place, and it does, this dateline devaluation is dangerous. If you write from anywhere, you write from nowhere. It is impossible to bear witness from digital distance, removed from the mire, the tears, the sediment in the syrupy coffee. No search engine gives you the stench of a crime, the tremor in the air, the eyes that smolder, or the cadence of a scream. No miracle of technology renders the lip-drying taste of fear. No news aggregator tells of the air reverberating from the shell's blast in the tapering valley. In war, it's the children and the aged, I have found, who wave, even from the ruins, the innocent and the wise. Look at them, write them down, carry them in your heavy heart. Believe that the words that describe the crime the powers of this earth wish you to forget will be read one day, those words, and at last, perhaps, justice done. Mo Ibrahim reminded us in no uncertain terms of the problems of our democracies. Why, he asked, should Africa take the West as a model? Why? A politicized Supreme Court in the United States, the storming of the Congress on January 6 last year, promised vaccines for Africa hoarded, soaring inequality, gerrymandering to suppress voters' rights, and the widespread disgruntlement and sense of exclusion that has led to the rise of the far right from Italy to Sweden. He has a point. All is not well in the free societies we cherish. Far from it. That came through loud and clear here. That promise von der Leyen spoke about is denied to too many citizens. We heard from Carsten Berg about the need for citizens' assemblies that restore a sense of genuine participation to democratic models that can seem broken. If all else fails, we were even promised the metaverse. Despite all our problems, I think I'd rather stay right here. I can't quite separate meta from metastasized. Yet, I feel a stirring in our democracies. The European Union has been galvanized by war on its doorstep. National borders provide no framework for addressing so many of the core problems of our age, chief among them climate change, and young people are acutely aware of that. As I've said, among the students here, I've felt a passionate engagement and passionate commitment to save this planet and work for a more just world. Perhaps Carolina Vigura's zebra should be our guiding principle. Nuance is not much favored in this age of declamation, of all or nothing, of primary colors and primal screams, of presumption of guilt, of failure to compromise. But most of life lies in the gray zones. Democracies are clumsy but adaptable. They are black and white. They're zebra-like. They are not monochrome. Perhaps Poland is indeed, like Italy and Sweden, on the long and winding and difficult road still to a better society beyond the current difficulties, of greater mutual understanding. It does not look likely now, but it's not impossible. We are not storage devices. We inhabit the intermediate zones. The human timber is crooked, as Immanuel Kant observed. Out of it, no straight thing was ever made. Isaiah Berlin wrote in The Crooked Timber of Humanity, no perfect solution is, not merely in practice, but in principle, possible in human affairs, and any determined attempt to produce it is likely to lead to suffering, disillusionment, and failure. Democracy is imperfect, ladies and gentlemen, and in that imperfection lies its distinctive humanity, its beauty, its elasticity, its terrifying fragility, the quality that every quest for utopia ends up crushing on the way to terror. In conclusion, I would like to say that this era feels more dangerous than any other moment I have known in my lifetime. Putin's war in Ukraine stemmed from the restoration of dangerous ideas of extreme nationalism, of imperialism, that led to the 20th century's greatest horrors and had seemed consigned to the past. Fritz Stern, the great historian of post-war Germany, once wrote that he was born in the Germany of 1926, quote, into a world on the cusp of avoidable disaster, on the cusp of avoidable disaster. I don't think we're far from that today. For Stern, the fragility of freedom was the simplest and deepest lesson of my life and work. Freedom is hard to recover once lost. The people of Ukraine have fought not only for their own liberty, but for that of every human being. If the Russian butchery in Bucha goes unmet, if the quest for justice is abandoned, barbarism extends its tentacles. We stand always at the cusp of avoidable disaster. And what is it that separates us from them? I would say it's vigilance and courage. As I learned long ago in the South Africa of my parents' birth, disaster is avoidable if the truth is upheld, dignity prized, and the intrinsic value of every single human being recognized. The words of W.H. Auden in 1939, on the eve of a world war that would take tens of millions of lives, should be read today in every classroom across our small, vulnerable, and ever warmer planet. And those words go, defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out, wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, I get quite emotional about these issues. And also about the hope I feel in this room. And people ask me, what's the Athens Democracy Forum about? Well, it's about that. It's about that hope that I see here and here and here and here. So thank you all. This is the end of the conference. The curtain, there's no curtain, but it comes down here. Thank you so much to Achilles Saltas, whose inspiration lies behind this conference, to Kim Konif-Teba, who done so much to make it happen, to Antigone, to Barbara, to countless people, all the technicians, all the various people who made sure the right things appeared on the screen at the right time. Thank you all. A lot goes into this behind the scenes. Thank you all above all for coming here, being part of this. And I hope you will take away a few things that will help guide you in the difficult times we're living through. Thank you.